Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. My name is Marcus Hoffman, and 6 months ago I was living in a cramped studio apartment in Portland, working data entry for an insurance company that treated me like a malfunctioning printer. Then my grandmother died and left me her house in Millbrook, Maine, a town so small it doesn't show up on most GPS systems unless you really know where to look. The house needed work. Hell, it needed a miracle. But it was mine. And after years of listening to my upstairs neighbor's enthusiastic 3 a.m. yoga sessions, the silence of rural Maine felt like luxury. I figured I'd fix it up, maybe flip it, use the money to start fresh somewhere warmer. That plan lasted exactly 2 weeks, until my savings ran dry and I realized that charming cottage with original features was real estate speak for foundation held together by prayers and lead paint. Enter Thornfield Antiques, on Route 2, squeezed between a defunct lobster shack and Brennan's Hardware. The owner, Mrs. Evelyn Carver, was exactly what you'd expect from someone running an antique shop in the middle of nowhere. Silver hair pulled back in a bun, reading glasses that looked like they belonged in the shop's inventory, and an uncanny ability to know what you were thinking before you said it. She hired me on the spot after I answered her Craigslist ad. No interview, no references checked. Just looked me up and down and said, "You've got the look of someone who minds their own business." That's rare these days. The pay was surprisingly good for night security, enough to cover the contractors slowly bringing my house back from the dead. The job seemed simple enough. Watch the store from midnight to 6 a.m., make sure nobody broke in to steal grandmother's china or Civil War memorabilia. Mrs. Carver explained that most of the valuable pieces were behind locked glass anyway, and that the security system would handle any real problems. What she didn't mention, what I didn't find out until my first night, was that some of those antiques weren't just old. They were occupied. I'm talking about the kind of possessed that makes the Annabelle doll look like a stuffed animal. Mrs. Carver has a collection that would make the Warrens pack up and find a new hobby. A music box that plays melodies no composer ever wrote. A mirror that shows reflections from rooms that don't exist in the building. A rocking chair that moves on its own, but only when you're not looking directly at it. And the rules. God, the rules. Mrs. Carver handed me a handwritten list on my first day, 7 rules in her spidery handwriting. "Follow these exactly," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Exactly, Marcus. The antiques here have arrangements, old agreements that keep them settled. Break the rules, and those arrangements become void." I thought she was just eccentric. Every small town has at least one oddball with too many cats or conspiracy theories. But Mrs. Carver had 7 rules and a collection of very angry dead things that really didn't like being disturbed. Here's what I've learned working nights at Thornfield Antiques. Some things are old because they're broken, and some things are old because they're still working exactly as intended. The problem is telling the difference before it's too late. My first night started normal enough. I pulled into the gravel lot around 11:30 p.m., picking my way past the potholes that could swallow a small car. The October air carried the scent of woodstoke and dying leaves. Classic Maine autumn. The store looked different in darkness, less quaint tourist trap and more abandoned movie set. Mrs. Carver met me at the back entrance, her key ring jangling like wind chimes. "Coffee pot's in the office," she said, handing me the 7 rules written on yellowed paper. "Read these first, then we'll do the walkthrough." I unfolded the paper under the fluorescent bulb in her small office. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Thornfield Antiques. Night security rules. Never enter the forgotten room. Basement door, marked with red X. The things stored there are not for sale. If the mahogany music box in case 7 opens by itself, close it immediately and count to 13. Do not listen to the melody. The Victorian rocking chair, aisle 3, northwest corner, will move when you're not watching. Let it. Face it directly for more than 60 seconds, and it will remember you. Between 2:47 and 3:05 a.m., stay in the office. Lock the door. Do not look through the window blinds during this time. If you hear a woman crying upstairs, it's coming from the widow's trunk. Aisle 5. Knock 3 times on any wall. The crying will stop. The antique telephone in aisle 1 will ring exactly once each night. Answer it and say only "wrong number." Hang up immediately. Before leaving at 6 a.m., check that all music boxes, jewelry boxes, and cabinet doors are closed. If any item has moved from its designated spot, mark it in the logbook. Do not attempt to move it back. I stared at the paper. Mrs. Carver, this is a joke, right? Some kind of initiation thing? She turned from where she'd been adjusting a display of Civil War bullets. Marcus, I've owned this shop for 37 years. In all that time, only 2 night guards have quit. Both broke the rules first. She pulled on her wool coat. The others followed them exactly. They all kept their jobs, and more importantly, they kept their sanity. What happens if... Don't find out. Her voice carried a weight that made my stomach drop. I've seen what happens when people treat this like a game. Follow the rules, collect your paycheck, and we'll get along fine. She left through the front door, the bell chiming her departure. I watched her ancient Buick disappear down Route 2, leaving me alone with a store full of antiques and a growing certainty that I had made a terrible career choice. I decided to start with the walkthrough she'd mentioned. The shop was larger than it appeared from outside, with narrow aisles winding between towering shelves and glass cases. Everything smelled like old wood and lavender, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of decades accumulated in dark corners. Aisle 1 housed the antique telephone, a black rotary model that looked like it belonged in a 1940s detective movie. Case 7 contained the mahogany music box Mrs. Carver had mentioned, its inlaid pearl and ebony pattern gleaming under the track lighting. The rocking chair sat exactly where the rules described, facing away from me. I checked my watch. 12:47 a.m. Nothing strange yet, just the normal settling sounds of an old building. The heating system kicked on with a wheeze that would have concerned me in any structure built after 1950. That's when I noticed the photographs. They covered most of the east wall. Old sepia prints in mismatched frames. Group photos of families I didn't recognize. Portraits of stern-faced Victorians, and what looked like documentation of various historical events around Maine. But as I moved closer, details emerged that made my skin crawl. In a photo of the 1902 Millbrook Harvest Festival, a shadow stood among the crowd. Distinctly human-shaped, but wrong somehow, like someone had cut out a piece of a different photograph and pasted it in. Another image showed a family reunion from the 1920s, but one face in the back row appeared to be screaming, while everyone else smiled serenely. I told myself the prints were old, damaged by time and poor storage. Photography from that era often had artifacts and distortions. But the more I studied them, the more convinced I became that these weren't accidents of age or chemistry. A sound from deeper in the store made me turn. Creaking wood, like footsteps on old floorboards. But the front door hadn't opened. I would have heard the bell. "Hello?" My voice echoed off the crowded shelves. "Mrs. Carver?" Silence. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the office and made my way toward the sound. The beam revealed aisles packed with furniture, shelves of dishware, and display cases full of jewelry and household items. Everything exactly as it should be. That's when I saw the rocking chair. It had moved. Not much. Maybe 6 inches from where I had first seen it, but definitely moved, because now it faced toward aisle 2 instead of the wall. Rule 3 echoed in my mind. The Victorian rocking chair will move when you're not watching. Let it. I backed away slowly, keeping the chair in my peripheral vision. Something about its carved wooden back and faded upholstery made my teeth ache, like fingernails on a chalkboard, but inside my skull. The antique telephone rang. One sharp, old-fashioned ring that cut through the silence like a scream. I ran back to aisle 1, my heart hammering against my ribs. The receiver felt heavy and cold in my hand. "Wrong number," I said, exactly as instructed, and hung up immediately. 1:15 a.m., 5 hours and 45 minutes left in my shift. I retreated to the office, locked the door, and made my first entry in the logbook. October 15th, 1:15 a.m. Chair moved approximately 6 inches. Telephone rang once. Rules followed. MH. Outside the office window, shadows moved between the aisles in ways that had nothing to do with the streetlight filtering through the front windows. The next 2 hours passed without incident. I stayed in the office, nursing coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the Clinton administration. Every sound made me look up. The building settling, the ancient radiator coughing to life, the wind rattling the windows, but nothing that required intervention. At 2:30 a.m., I decided to do another walkthrough. Rule 4 specified staying in the office between 2:47 and 3:05, so I had about 15 minutes to check the store. The rocking chair had moved again. Now it faced aisle 4 entirely, its carved arms positioned like it was waiting for someone. I gave it a wide berth, focusing instead on the jewelry cases near the front windows. That's when I saw her reflection. Not in the mirrors hanging on the walls. Those showed exactly what they should. But in the glass covering a case of Victorian brooches, a woman stood behind me. Pale dress, dark hair pinned up in an old-fashioned style, face obscured by the store's lighting. I spun around. Empty aisle. When I looked back at the glass, she was gone. My hands shook as I checked my watch. 2:44 a.m. 3 minutes to get back to the office. I moved faster than I'd intended, weaving between displays and trying not to knock over anything expensive. The office door clicked shut behind me at 2:46. I turned the lock and backed away from the small window that looked out over the store floor. According to the rules, I wasn't supposed to look through the blinds during the next 18 minutes. But I could still hear. At 2:47 exactly, the sounds began. Footsteps, multiple sets, walking through the aisles with purpose. Not the careful steps of a customer browsing. These moved with familiarity, like people who knew exactly where they were going. I heard voices too, muffled conversations in a language I couldn't identify. Sometimes laughter. A woman's voice rose above the others, singing something that might have been a lullaby. The melody was beautiful and wrong, like hearing your favorite song played in a minor key. Something heavy crashed to the floor in aisle 6, then another crash, closer to the office. The singing stopped. One set of footsteps approached the office door. Slow, deliberate steps that paused right outside. The doorknob turned back and forth, testing the lock. Metal scraped against metal as whatever stood there tried to force the door. I pressed myself against the back wall, staring at the brass handle as it jerked left and right. The blind covering the window rustled, something pressing against it from the outside. Don't look through the blinds. The handle stopped moving. The footsteps retreated. At 3:05 a.m., everything went silent. I waited another full minute before unlocking the door. The store looked exactly as I'd left it. No overturned displays, no scattered merchandise. Even the case of Victorian brooches remained intact, its glass uncracked. But the air smelled different, colder, with a trace of something floral and cloying. Funeral flowers. I made my rounds, checking each aisle methodically. Everything seemed normal until I reached the northwest corner of aisle 3. The rocking chair had moved again, but this time it faced the office directly. Its seat cushion bore an indentation, as if someone had been sitting there recently. Aisle 5 caught my attention next. A large steamer trunk sat among the other furniture, the widow's trunk mentioned in Rule 5. Brass corners, leather straps, and a brass nameplate that read E. Morrison, 1899. The kind of trunk that spoke of long voyages and carefully packed belongings. As I approached, I heard it. Crying. A woman sobbing with the kind of grief that seemed to pull the sound from her soul rather than her throat. The weeping came from inside the trunk, muffled but unmistakable. Rule 5. If you hear a woman crying upstairs, it's coming from the widow's trunk. Knock 3 times on any wall. The crying will stop. But the rule said upstairs. The store was single-story, with only the office overlooking part of the sales floor. I was definitely on the ground level, and the crying was definitely coming from the trunk. Maybe upstairs meant any elevated position. The office was raised slightly above the main floor. Close enough. The sobbing intensified, becoming almost hysteric. I felt an overwhelming urge to open the trunk, to see what was wrong, to help. My hand reached for the brass latch. No, follow the rules exactly. I backed away from the trunk and knocked 3 times on the nearest wall. Hard, sharp raps that echoed through the store. The crying stopped immediately, cut off mid-sob like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed felt heavier than the weeping. I checked my watch. 3:47 a.m. Still hours to go. My logbook entry for this shift was going to be longer than War and Peace. Returning to the office, I tried to focus on anything except the growing certainty that I was trapped in a building with things that had no business existing. I counted inventory sheets, organized paperwork, even attempted to fix the broken stapler Mrs. Carver kept in the top drawer. At 4:23 a.m., the music box opened. I heard it from the office. A tiny mechanical whirring, followed by the first few notes of a melody I'd never heard before. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, like a dance between major and minor keys that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Rule 2. If the mahogany music box in case 7 opens by itself, close it immediately and count to 13. Do not listen to the melody. But I was already listening. The notes seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating inside my chest cavity. Each phrase of the melody painted images in my mind. A ballroom filled with dancers in period dress, candles flickering in crystal chandeliers, a woman in white spinning alone in the center of the floor. She turned to look at me, and her face was missing. I ran to case 7, fumbling with the small key Mrs. Carver had shown me. The music box sat in the center of the display, its lid open to reveal tiny brass figures, dancing in endless circles. A small ballerina spun on a central post, her porcelain face cracked down the middle. I slammed the lid shut and began counting. 1, 2, 3. The melody continued playing, muffled now but still audible. The notes seemed angry, discordant. 11, 12, 13. Silence. My hands trembled as I locked the case again. The images from the melody lingered. That ballroom, those dancers, the woman with no face. I could still feel the phantom waltz in my head, a rhythm that made me want to spin and glide across the store floor. I caught myself taking a step toward the open area near the front windows. ready to dance to music that had stopped playing. The spell broke when I noticed the time. 5:15 a.m. Less than an hour left. I spent the remaining time in the office, doors locked, blinds drawn. Every few minutes I'd hear something. A shelf creaking, a floorboard groaning, the soft whisper of fabric against wood. But I didn't investigate. I'd learned enough for one night. At exactly 6 a.m., Mrs. Carver's Buick crunched over the gravel outside. I gathered my things and prepared to leave, but first I had to complete the final rule. Rule 7. Before leaving at 6 a.m., check that all music boxes, jewelry boxes, and cabinet doors are closed. If any item has moved from its designated spot, mark it in the logbook. Do not attempt to move it back. The walkthrough revealed 3 more changes. The rocking chair now faced the front door. A jewelry box in case 12 had opened, spilling costume pearls across the display shelf. And in aisle 2, a grandfather clock that had been showing 4:15 when I'd seen it earlier now read 11:47, different from every other clock in the store. I documented everything in the logbook, signed my name, and met Mrs. Carver at the back door. "How was your first night?" she asked, hanging her coat on a hook by the door. "Eventful," I said. "The rules. They're really necessary, aren't they?" She nodded, already moving toward her desk. "The antiques here have been collected over many decades, Marcus. Some of them came with attachments. Previous owners, you might say. The rules keep everyone peaceful." "What happens if I break one?" Mrs. Carver paused, her hand on a stack of invoices. The first guard who worked here thought Rule 3 was silly. He stared at the rocking chair for 5 straight minutes, just to prove nothing would happen. And he quit the next morning, refused to tell me why, just said he couldn't come back. I found him a month later at Eastern Maine Medical Center, psychiatric ward. Still there as far as I know. Keeps talking about a woman in a rocking chair who follows him everywhere he goes. She settled into her desk chair and opened her ledger. "Get some rest, Marcus. Tomorrow night will be worse. They're always worse once they've noticed you." I went home and slept like the dead, which probably wasn't the best metaphor considering where I worked. When I woke up at 7 p.m., I found myself checking every mirror in my house, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. My second night started with Mrs. Carver waiting in the parking lot. She handed me a thermos of coffee that actually tasted decent and a small leather-bound notebook. "Additional observations," she explained. "Previous night guards kept notes about patterns, timing, things that might help you. Read it when you have quiet moments." Inside, the store felt different, more aware. The moment I stepped through the back door, I sensed attention focusing on me from a dozen directions. The rocking chair had returned to its original position, but somehow I knew it was watching. I settled into the office with the notebook. The first entry was dated 3 years ago. Guard's notes. P. Jensen, Night 1. Followed rules exactly. Phone rang 12:47 a.m. Music box opened 4:15 a.m. Chair moved 3 times. Night 3. Music box melody lasted longer when closed. Counted to 13 twice before it stopped. Night 7. Woman's crying from trunk included words. Sounded like "find him." Don't think I should investigate. Night 15. Red X door in basement. Something scratches from inside during 2:47 to 3:05 period. Sounds like fingernails on wood. The entries continued for 6 months before P. Jensen stopped writing. The next guard, M. Torres, picked up where Jensen left off. Night 1, Jensen left these notes. Chair recognized me immediately. Moved to face office before I even finished rules reading. Night 4. Music box ballerina wasn't cracked when I started. Crack gets bigger each time the box opens. Night 12. Heard Jensen's voice during the 2:47 period. He was talking to someone about finding a way out. He quit 2 months ago. Torres's notes spanned 8 months. The last entry was unsettling. Night 243. The woman in the trunk said my name tonight. She knows I'm here. Chair has moved to face basement door. I think they're connected somehow. Tomorrow is my last night. Can't take early retirement fast enough. The current notebook belonged to my immediate predecessor, K. Sullivan, night guard notes. Mrs. Carver says I'm the 20th guard in 37 years. Average employment, 8.7 months. Makes sense now. Night 1. Rules are real. All of them. Night 56. Music box melody is getting longer, up to 3 minutes before it stops. Ballerina's crack now extends down her entire dress. Night 134. Woman in trunk cries every night now, not just when I'm upstairs. Rules might be evolving. Night 201. Found something. In the 1987 newspaper archives at Millbrook Library. Fire at Thornfield Mansion, where the shop is built. Family of 5 died. Woman named Eleanor Morrison lost her husband and 3 children. Same name on the trunk. The entries stopped abruptly after night 201. No explanation, no goodbye. Just gone. At 11:45 p.m., I made my first rounds. Everything seemed normal until I noticed something new in aisle 4. A hand mirror with an ornate silver handle sat on a shelf that had been empty yesterday. The price tag read $45, but something about the mirror made my stomach turn. I moved closer. The reflection showed my face, but wrong somehow. My eyes looked older, more tired, like I'd been working these night shifts for years instead of days. Dark circles under my eyes that I didn't have in real life. A scar on my forehead that didn't exist. I turned away quickly and continued my rounds. The telephone rang at 12:33 a.m., earlier than usual. I answered with the prescribed wrong number and hung up. But as I set the receiver down, I heard something that made me freeze. A dial tone that became a woman's voice. He's not here anymore. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, half convinced I'd imagined it. The rules said answer and hang up immediately. They didn't mention what to do if the caller spoke back. At 1:15 a.m., the music box opened on its own. This time, I watched the ballerina spin as I approached case 7. She moved in perfect time with the melody, her cracked porcelain face catching the track lighting. But as I reached for the lid, she stopped spinning and turned to look directly at me. The melody continued, but the ballerina's gaze followed my movements. Her painted smile seemed wider than before, and the crack down her dress had indeed grown. It now split her entirely in half, leaving a dark line from neck to hem. I slammed the lid shut and counted to 13. The music stopped, but I swear I heard something else. A tiny porcelain hand tapping against the inside of the box. The woman in the trunk started crying at 2:15 a.m., well before I was supposed to be upstairs. The sobbing was more violent tonight, punctuated by words I could almost understand. I knocked 3 times on the nearest wall. The crying stopped, replaced by what sounded like scratching from inside the trunk. Then the voice, clear as day. Marcus. She knew my name. At 2:47 a.m., I locked myself in the office and prepared for the 18-minute lockdown. But tonight was different. Tonight, I heard footsteps approaching from the basement. The red X door that led to the forgotten room. Rule 1 explicitly forbade entering, but something was coming up from down there, and it didn't care about rules. Heavy footsteps climbed stairs I couldn't see, getting closer to the main floor. The office door shook as something large moved past it. Then came the voices, not the usual conversations in unknown languages. These voices spoke English, and I recognized one of them. told her we'd find a way. It was Jensen, the previous guard who'd quit 3 years ago. His voice carried clearly through the office door, talking to someone about escape plans and weak points in the arrangement. A woman answered, the same voice I'd heard from the trunk. Eleanor Morrison, if Kay Sullivan's research was accurate. The new one is stronger, Eleanor said. He follows the rules, but he questions them. That's dangerous. Or useful, Jensen replied. If we can convince him to help. Help with what? A third voice, male, unfamiliar. Breaking the bindings? You know what happens if we're set loose. I know what happens if we stay here forever, Eleanor snapped. I know what happens to each guard that works these shifts. They all leave eventually, but part of them stays behind. Look at young Marcus. He's already changing. The conversation moved away from the office, heading toward the front of the store. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear more, but the voices faded. At 3:05 a.m. exactly, silence returned. But the implications of what I'd heard kept me awake for the rest of my shift. The mirror in aisle 4 showing an older, more tired version of myself. Eleanor knowing my name. Jensen's voice among the entities during the forbidden time. I thought about Kay Sullivan's research. Eleanor Morrison, who lost her family in the fire where the shop now stood. But what about the others? How many people had died on this property over the decades? How many guards had quit, leaving pieces of themselves behind? The rocking chair had moved again. Now it faced the basement door directly. During my 3:30 a.m. rounds, I noticed the hand mirror had changed too. The reflection now showed me in the same clothes, but standing in different places throughout the store. As I watched, the reflected Marcus turned and walked toward the rocking chair. I spun around, expecting to see myself moving involuntarily. But I stood exactly where I should be, staring at a mirror that showed me doing things I wasn't doing. The rest of the night passed in tense quiet. No more spontaneous music box openings. No crying from the trunk. Even the usual footsteps and settling sounds seemed muted, as if the building itself was waiting for something. At 5:30 a.m., I decided to check something. In the office, I pulled out my phone and took a selfie. Then I walked to aisle 4 and held my phone up next to the hand mirror. In the mirror's reflection, I stood alone. My phone showed my face clearly, but the mirror reflected empty space where I should have been. I backed away from the mirror and checked my phone again. Normal selfie. Normal reflection in every other surface. But in that hand mirror, I cast no reflection at all. Mrs. Carver arrived at exactly 6 a.m., same as always. As I completed my final walkthrough, I noticed 3 things had moved. The rocking chair, now facing the front windows. The hand mirror, rotated 90 degrees on its shelf, and something I hadn't seen before, a photograph that had fallen behind the widow's trunk. I picked up the photo carefully. It showed the exterior of a large Victorian mansion, clearly the same property where the shop now stood. Written on the back in faded ink, Thornfield House, 1887. Morrison family summer home. 5 people stood on the front porch. A man, woman, and 3 children. A boy of maybe 16, 2 younger girls. The woman wore a dress identical to the one I'd seen in the case reflections. Eleanor Morrison and her family. They all looked happy. I tucked the photograph into the logbook and signed out for the night. Mrs. Carver looked up from her morning coffee as I prepared to leave. "Finding everything in order?" she asked. "Define order," I said. "Mrs. Carver, how much do you know about the Morrisons, the family that lived here before?" Her cup paused halfway to her lips. "Why do you ask?" "I found this." I showed her the photograph. She studied it for a long moment, then handed it back. Keep it safe, Marcus. Some of them don't like remembering what they lost. Some of them? The fire that destroyed the mansion wasn't an accident. Eleanor Morrison's husband was experimenting with things that shouldn't be experimented with, trying to contact their deceased relatives. When it went wrong, it went spectacularly wrong. She stood up and moved to the window overlooking the store. The entities here aren't just random spirits, Marcus. They're family. And family has complicated relationships, even in death. I left with more questions than answers, the photograph burning a hole in my pocket. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. In my rearview mirror, I kept seeing a woman in an old-fashioned dress walking along Route 2, always just at the edge of my vision. When I looked directly, the road was empty. I spent the entire day researching at the Millbrook Public Library. The librarian, a thin woman named Janet Pooler, who looked like she'd been organizing books since the Dewey Decimal System was invented, helped me dig through old newspaper archives. The fire happened on October 31st, 1887. The Bangor Daily News ran the story. Tragic fire claims prominent family. The estate of Charles Morrison, noted antiquarian and collector, was destroyed by fire last evening. Mr. Morrison, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children perished in the blaze. Authorities report the fire began in the mansion's basement laboratory, where Mr. Morrison conducted private research. Neighbors described strange lights and sounds coming from the property in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. I found more details in the Millbrook Weekly Gazette. Morrison had become obsessed with contacting his deceased father through seances and experimental apparatus. Reverend David Hawthorne of St. Mark's Episcopal warned Morrison repeatedly about his dangerous pursuits, but was rebuffed. The fire appears to have started during one of Morrison's nightly sessions. But here's what made my blood freeze: a follow-up article from November 15th, 1887. Morrison's servants report strange occurrences. Mary Sullivan and Thomas Green, the only Morrison estate employees to survive the fire, report disturbing events at the ruins. Both claim to hear voices calling from the burned foundation and to see figures walking the grounds at night. Miss Sullivan states she has heard Mrs. Morrison calling for her children. Sullivan, the same last name as Kay Sullivan, the guard whose notes I've been reading. Family connection? Coincidence? In a town this small, probably the former. Janet helped me find one more document. A property deed from 1925, when Evelyn Carver's grandfather purchased the land and built Thornfield Antiques on the foundation of the mansion. Strange choice, Janet commented, adjusting her reading glasses. Building a business on ground where a whole family died. But old Harold Carver was always a practical man. Got the land cheap because nobody else wanted it. I returned to the shop that night with a head full of questions and a growing suspicion that Mrs. Carver had been less than honest about what she knew. The store felt different again, more crowded, though nothing had changed visually. The air seemed thicker, like too many people breathing in a closed space. As I entered through the back door, I could swear I heard children's laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the building. Mrs. Carver's note sat on the office desk. Marcus. Had to leave early for doctor's appointment. Everything normal today. Keys are in the usual drawer. EC. But everything wasn't normal. The rocking chair had moved again, this time positioned perfectly in the center of aisle 3, facing the office. More concerning, the red X marking the basement door had been scratched away, leaving only faint traces of tape residue. I checked my watch. 11:58 p.m. Almost time for the phone to ring. At exactly midnight, it did. I answered with the prescribed response, but again heard something after hanging up. This time, multiple voices speaking over each other. He knows about the fire. Found the photograph. Sullivan's grandniece told him everything. The line went dead. I grabbed the guard notebooks and flipped through them more carefully, looking for patterns I'd missed. In Jensen's notes, I found an entry I'd overlooked. Night 89. Something wrong with Rule 7. Checked all boxes and doors before leaving, but when I came back, found basement door standing open. Red X was intact, but door was definitely open. Mrs. Carver claims it was closed when she arrived. Either she's lying or something opened it after I left. Torres had similar observations. Night 156. Basement door issues continue. Mrs. Carver installed new deadbolt. Found it unlocked 3 times this week. She insists only she has the key. K. Sullivan's final entries were the most revealing. Night 198. Broke rule tonight. Went into basement during day shift. Found Morrison's original laboratory, mostly intact. Equipment still there, though covered in ash and debris. Found journal hidden in a metal box. Charles Morrison was trying to anchor spirits to physical objects. The antiques upstairs aren't just haunted, they're prisons. Night 201. Confronted Mrs. Carver about the basement. She admitted her grandfather knew exactly what he was building on. The Carver family has been maintaining some kind of agreement with the Morrisons for 3 generations. Guards aren't here to protect the antiques from thieves. We're here to keep the spirits contained. That was Sullivan's last entry. At 1:30 a.m., the music box opened. But this time, when I reached Case 7, the ballerina wasn't alone. 3 small figurines I'd never seen before shared the music box with her. 2 young girls and a boy, all dancing in a circle around the central post. They looked handcrafted, not factory-made like the ballerina. The Morrison children. The melody that played was different too. Instead of the usual waltz, it sounded like a children's song, something you might hear at a school recital. The tiny figurines turned in perfect synchronization, their painted faces smiling up at me. I slammed the lid shut and counted to 13, but the music continued. The counting reached 20 before it finally stopped. When I unlocked the case and opened it again, the children were gone. Only the cracked ballerina remained, but her face had changed. Where the crack used to divide her features, there was now a painted expression of absolute terror. The crying from the widow's trunk started at 2 a.m. But tonight, it wasn't alone. Children's voices joined in, not crying, but trying to comfort someone. I heard fragments. "Don't cry, Mama. We're all here. Papa says we can't leave yet." I knocked 3 times on the wall, and this time the response was immediate. "Marcus." Eleanor's voice, clear and direct. "I know you found the photograph. I know what you learned today." I backed away from the trunk, but her voice followed me. My husband's experiments didn't fail. They succeeded too well. He bound us here to these objects, to this place. We can't leave, and we can't rest. I wanted to run, to forget the rules and flee the building, but my feet stayed planted. The rules aren't random, Marcus. They're spells, bindings, ways to keep us controllable. But each guard who works here becomes connected to us. When you leave, part of you stays behind. Eventually, that part grows strong enough to speak. "What do you want?" I asked the empty store. "What any mother wants, to protect my children. Mrs. Carver's family has kept us trapped for nearly a century and a half. They collect guards like employees, adding your spirits to theirs when you finally break." The lights in aisle 5 flickered, and I saw them. Translucent figures moving between the shelves. A man in a Victorian suit carrying what looked like scientific instruments. 3 children playing some elaborate game of tag, and Eleanor standing beside the trunk, her face pale but determined. The rules can be broken, Marcus, but not by us. We tried to tell Jensen, tried to tell Torres and Sullivan. They all left before they understood. Understood what? The basement door doesn't lead to storage. It leads to my husband's laboratory. Everything is still there. The equipment, the bindings, the anchor points. Destroy those, and we can finally rest. The 2:47 a.m. lockdown approached. I have to get back to the office, I said. The lockdown is when we're strongest, when the barriers between us and your world are thinnest. During those 18 minutes, you could go to the basement. You could end this. And break Rule 1? Rule 1 was created to protect the Carver's secret, not to protect you. I heard Mrs. Carver's car pulling into the lot, but according to my watch, it was only 2:45 a.m. She wasn't supposed to be here for hours. She knows, Eleanor whispered urgently. She knows you've been researching. The Carvers have ways of monitoring what guards learned. You're in danger, Marcus. I ran back to the office and locked the door just as Mrs. Carver's key turned in the back entrance. Through the window blinds, I watched her move through the store with a purpose I'd never seen before. She carried what looked like a large leather satchel. She went straight to the basement door. At 2:47 a.m. exactly, instead of the usual sounds of spiritual activity, I heard power tools. Drilling, hammering, what sounded like construction work coming from below. Mrs. Carver was reinforcing whatever was down there. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She hadn't hired me to protect the antiques. She'd hired me to be the next spirit in her collection, and she could sense I was getting too close to the truth. When the sounds stopped at 3:05 a.m., I heard her footsteps returning to the back door. Her car started and drove away. I spent the rest of my shift staring at that basement door, knowing that behind it lay answers, consequences, and probably my doom. But for the first time since starting this job, I wondered if following the rules was the real trap. The hand mirror in aisle 4 showed a different reflection now. Instead of an older, tired version of myself, it showed me standing in what looked like a Victorian-era laboratory, surrounded by strange equipment and glowing symbols carved into stone walls. In the reflection, I wasn't alone. Jensen stood beside me, then Torres, then Kay Sullivan. All the previous guards who had vanished after learning too much. All of them were pointing at something beyond the mirror's frame. All of them were pointing down. I didn't go home after my shift ended. Instead, I drove to the 24-hour diner on Route 1A and sat in a corner booth, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of everything I'd learned. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Dolores, kept refilling my cup without asking. She'd probably seen plenty of people having existential crises over pancakes at 7 a.m. By noon, I'd made a decision. I called Mrs. Carver. "Marcus, is everything all right? You sound tired. I need to ask you something directly, Mrs. Carver. Are you keeping those spirits imprisoned?" A long pause. "Where are you right now?" "Dolores's diner. And before you ask, I haven't told anyone else what I've learned." "Stay there. I'll be right over." 30 minutes later, Mrs. Carver slid into the booth across from me. She looked older than usual, lines of exhaustion etched deep around her eyes. The leather satchel from last night sat beside her on the seat. "How much do you know?" she asked. "Enough to understand that Rule 1 isn't about protecting me from the basement. It's about protecting Charles Morrison's prison from being discovered." She nodded slowly. "My grandfather made a deal with an abomination, Marcus. Charles Morrison succeeded in his experiments far beyond what he intended. He didn't just contact the dead. He created a method to trap souls in physical objects, to keep them conscious and aware indefinitely. Dolores appeared with coffee for Mrs. Carver, who waited until she was gone before continuing. The fire wasn't an accident. Eleanor Morrison discovered what her husband had done, that he'd bound their children's souls to his antiques as experimental subjects. She tried to destroy everything, but the bindings held even as the mansion burned. Her family died in body, but remained trapped in spirit. Why didn't your grandfather just destroy everything then? Because by the time he built the shop, Charles Morrison had become something worse than a ghost. The ritual that killed his family also transformed him into something like a demon. Powerful, angry, and completely insane. He turned the basement into an anchor point, using it to control not just his family's spirits, but any supernatural energy that came near the property. Mrs. Carver took a sip of coffee, her hands shaking slightly. My grandfather discovered that if Charles was released, he could potentially claim every soul in Millbrook. The only way to contain him was to keep the spirits of his family bound to the antiques. They serve as a buffer, a barrier. As long as Eleanor and the children remain trapped upstairs, Charles stays locked in the basement. What about the guards? The night shifts. They're necessary because the spirits need human energy to maintain their strength. A living person working in proximity to the antiques feeds the bindings that keep Charles contained. But here's the horrible truth. Every guard who works here long enough becomes part of the system. The job changes you, makes you spiritually vulnerable. When you eventually quit, part of me stays behind. Your spirit becomes another layer of protection, another barrier between Charles and the world. My family has been using night guards as sacrificial buffers for 5 generations. I stared at her. And you're telling me this why? Shouldn't this be the part where you drug my coffee and make me disappear? She opened the leather satchel and pulled out an old leather journal. Because I'm old, Marcus, and I don't have children. When I die, this all becomes someone else's problem. Someone who might not understand the stakes. She slid the journal across the table. Charles Morrison's original research notes. Everything he learned about binding souls. Everything he planned. I opened the journal. The pages were filled with diagrams, equations, and notes, written in a cramped, increasingly erratic handwriting. Sketches of ritual circles, soul-binding sigils, and something that looked like architectural plans for a spiritual prison. He was planning to expand beyond his family, Mrs. Carver continued. He wanted to create an army of bound souls, all under his control. A legion of spirits to do his bidding. The fire stopped him from completing this plan, but didn't stop him from existing. One page caught my attention. A diagram showing how to reverse the binding process, labeled Liberation Protocol, use only in extremis. Mrs. Carver, this shows how to freedom. Yes, but freeing Eleanor and the children also means unleashing Charles. He spent 137 years gaining strength in that basement, feeding off the spiritual energy of the antiques and every guard who's worked here. If he gets out, what if there was a way to free the family, but keep Charles contained? She shook her head. The bindings are interconnected. Charles used his own family as anchors for his power. Release them, and his prison weakens catastrophically. I studied the journal more carefully, reading Charles's increasingly mad ramblings about souls and power and eternal servitude. But between the lines of insanity, I saw something else. A flaw in his design. Look at this entry. I pointed to a page near the end. He writes about sympathetic rebellion and cascade failures. He was worried about what would happen if the bound spirits worked together against the bindings. Mrs. Carver leaned forward, reading over my shoulder. I've never seen this page before. Charles wasn't just afraid of his bindings being broken from the outside. He was afraid of them being broken from within. If Eleanor and the children could coordinate their efforts, use their own spiritual energy in just the right way, they could break their own bonds without weakening Charles's prison. Mrs. Carver finished. But that would require precise knowledge of the binding structure, knowledge that only Charles possessed, knowledge that's written right here in his journal. We sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding the implications. Finally, Mrs. Carver spoke. "You realize what you're proposing, don't you? You'd have to enter that basement. You'd have to face Charles Morrison directly and somehow communicate this information to his family's spirits while he tries to bind your soul to his collection. The alternative is to keep enslaving night guards forever. Marcus, guards who enter that basement don't come back out. Not alive, anyway. Charles has been waiting 137 years for someone to break Rule 1. He's prepared for intrusion. Then why are you helping me? Why give me the journal?" Mrs. Carver closed her eyes. "Because I've maintained this prison my entire adult life, and I'm tired of being a jailer. If there's even a chance that Eleanor's family can free themselves without dooming the world, they deserve that chance." I took the journal and stood up. "I'm going back tonight. Will you help me? I can disable the security system and ensure we're not interrupted. But Marcus, if this goes wrong, if Charles gets loose, I'll do whatever is necessary to stop him, even if it means sealing that basement with you inside." That night, we arrived at the shop together at 11 p.m. Mrs. Carver disabled the alarm system and unlocked the basement door. The red X had been reapplied with fresh tape, but underneath I could see scratches in the wood where something had been clawing at it from below. "The stairs lead down about 30 feet, Mrs. Carver explained. "The laboratory takes up the entire basement. Charles's spiritual anchor is a large obsidian altar in the center of the room. Whatever you do, don't touch it directly." I descended the wooden stairs, Charles Morrison's journal clutched in one hand, a heavy-duty flashlight in the other. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with stone walls that looked much older than the rest of the building. The air smelled of sulfur and burnt metal. The laboratory was a nightmare of Victorian-era scientific equipment mixed with occult paraphernalia. Glass tubes filled with unknown liquids connected brass instruments to carved stone surfaces. Ritual circles were etched into the floor, inlaid with what looked like silver and some dark metal I couldn't identify. At the center of it, all stood the obsidian altar Mrs. Carver had mentioned. It was roughly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. A presence radiated from it, malevolent, ancient, and very aware of my intrusion. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath formed clouds in the suddenly frigid air. "Welcome, night guard." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the stone walls. Deep, cultured, with a hint of madness around the edges. "You have something that belongs to me." Charles Morrison's spirit continued. "My research. My life's work." I opened the journal and began reading aloud from the Liberation Protocol, focusing on the sections about internal rebellion and sympathetic breakage. As I spoke, the symbols on the altar flared with sick green light. "Stop." The voice carried command and fury. "You don't understand what you're doing. Release my family and you release me. I'll have my army of souls, and your world will know servitude, unlike anything." "That's where you're wrong, Charles." Eleanor's voice filled the basement, followed by footsteps on the stairs. The spirits of the Morrison family descended into the laboratory, Eleanor in her pale dress, the 3 children holding hands, all of them looking more solid than I'd ever seen them. "We've been listening, husband. Learning." Every night for 137 years, we've felt the bindings you placed on us. We know their structure now. Charles's presence pressed against my mind, trying to force me to drop the journal. But Eleanor moved between us, and suddenly the pressure lifted. You made a mistake in your bindings, Charles. You assumed we would remain the people we were in life. Obedient, trusting, loving. But death changes you. Imprisonment changes you more. The children stepped forward, their hands still linked. As they moved, light began emanating from their spirits. Not the sick green of Charles's power, but something cleaner, brighter. Read the formula, Marcus, Eleanor instructed. The sequence that begins with sympathetic resonance. I found the passage and began reciting it. As I spoke, Eleanor and the children began their own chant in what sounded like Latin. The binding symbols on the altar flickered, and I felt Charles's rage building like pressure in a boiler. No. His voice shook the entire building. I will not be denied, not after so long. The obsidian altar cracked down the middle. Charles's spirit materialized above it. Tall, gaunt, wearing the face of a man but with eyes like burning coals. His form shifted and writhed, never quite settling into a solid shape. But the children's light grew brighter. Eleanor stepped forward and placed her hand on the cracked altar. Goodbye, Charles. Enjoy your solitude. The binding symbols flared one last time, then went dark. The oppressive presence that had filled the basement for over a century suddenly contracted, pulling back toward the altar as if being sucked into a void. Charles's spirit spiraled down into the obsidian, his screams of rage fading as the crack sealed itself. Eleanor and the children began to fade, becoming translucent. Is it over? I asked. For us, yes. We're free to move on. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time, it looked genuine. For Charles, he's now bound by his own altar, trapped in the prison he created for others. The bindings that held us now hold him alone. What about the antiques upstairs? Just antiques now. Old things with interesting histories, but no longer prisons. She looked at her children, who were becoming harder to see by the moment. Thank you, Marcus. We can rest now. The Morrison family faded away, leaving me alone in a basement that suddenly felt like just a basement. Cold, musty, and full of old junk. The oppressive, supernatural weight was gone. I climbed the stairs and found Mrs. Carver waiting by the basement door, tears streaming down her face. Is it done? She asked. It's done. They're free. She collapsed into a chair, sobbing. 37 years. 37 years I've maintained that prison. I thought I'd die before it could end. We spent the next hour removing equipment from the basement, carrying up the more dangerous-looking items to be properly disposed of. The obsidian altar we left alone. It was too heavy to move, and something told me it was better left undisturbed. As we worked, Mrs. Carver explained what would happen next. The antiques upstairs are just antiques now. I'll reopen as a normal shop, no more night shifts needed. You're welcome to stay on as day help if you want, but I understand if you'd rather find other work. I thought about it. What about the guards who are already bound to this place? Jensen, Torres, Sullivan, the others. With the Morrison family free and Charles contained, those partial spirits should be able to move on naturally. It might take time, but they're no longer trapped. As the sun rose over Millbrook, we finished cleaning up. Mrs. Carver locked the basement door one final time and handed me the key. That door stays locked, she said. What's down there is contained, but not destroyed. Charles Morrison is alone with his obsidian altar and his own madness, which is exactly what he deserves. I pocketed the key, understanding the responsibility. Some prisons are necessary, even if the jailer changes. Walking home through the Maine morning, I felt lighter than I had in months. The October air still carried the scent of dying leaves, but now it just smelled like autumn instead of death and secrets. Behind me, Thornfield Antiques stood quiet and normal in the early sunlight. Finally, just a shop selling beautiful old things to people who loved history. The way it should have been all along. 3 weeks passed before I realized the story wasn't over. Mrs. Carver had reopened Thornfield Antiques as a normal shop, complete with daytime hours and cheerful window displays. She hired 2 part-time employees from town, college students who needed flexible schedules and didn't ask questions about why all the really old pieces had been moved to the back room. I stayed on as assistant manager, partly because the pay was still good, partly because someone needed to keep an eye on that basement door. Mrs. Carver had offered to get it professionally sealed, but something about that felt wrong. Charles Morrison's prison needed a guardian, even if that guardian was just a guy with anxiety and too much curiosity for his own good. The shop felt completely different during the day. Customers browsed peacefully among the Victorian furniture and Civil War memorabilia. Children pressed their faces against the glass cases. Mothers examined china patterns, and tourists searched for authentic Maine antiques to take home. Everything normal, everything mundane, until the dreams started. At first, they were just fragments. I'd see Eleanor Morrison standing in my kitchen, or catch glimpses of the 3 children playing in my backyard. Pleasant dreams, almost. The family looked happy, at peace. Sometimes Eleanor would smile and nod, like she was checking to make sure I was all right. But after 2 weeks, the dreams changed. I started seeing other people, men and women I didn't recognize, but who moved through the shop with familiarity. They wore clothes from different eras, some Victorian, like the Morrisons, others more modern. 1920s dresses, 1940s suits, clothing from the 60s and 70s and 80s. In the dreams, these people worked at the shop. They rearranged displays, helped customers, counted inventory, all performing the duties of night guards, but during the day. On the 15th night, I woke to find someone sitting in my bedroom chair. It was a man in his 30s, wearing a cardigan and thick-rimmed glasses that screamed 1960s college professor. He looked solid, real, but the moonlight passed through him without casting shadows. "Don't be afraid," he said. "My name is Paul Jensen. I worked the night shift at Thornfield from 1971 to 1974. I sat up slowly, surprisingly calm. You're the P. Jensen from the logbooks." "That's right. Look, Marcus, I don't have much time. The Morrison family being freed created some ripples. Those of us who got partially trapped over the years, we're between states right now. Not fully alive, not fully dead, but not bound to the shop anymore either. Mrs. Carver said you'd be able to move on naturally." Jensen laughed, but it sounded hollow. "We can, but there's something we need to do first. Something we learned while we were trapped that the living need to know." He stood up and moved to my window, looking out toward Route 2. "Charles Morrison wasn't the only one, Marcus. He wasn't even the first." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" "While we were bound to the shop, we could sense things beyond it. There are other places like Thornfield, other families like the Morrisons. Charles was part of a larger network of occultists in the late 1800s, all experimenting with soul binding and spiritual imprisonment. When he succeeded, word spread." Jensen turned back to me, his transparent form flickering slightly. "There's a place in Salem, Massachusetts, an old boarding house where the owner trapped the spirits of women accused of witchcraft. A mansion in Savannah where a plantation owner bound the souls of murdered slaves to the property. A theater in San Francisco where the architect created a supernatural performance that never ends. I felt the familiar weight of dread settling in my stomach. They're all still operating? The families who inherited these places, yes. Like the Carvers, they've spent generations maintaining the prisons, using human guards as spiritual buffers. But what they don't understand is that the bindings are weakening. Jensen sat back down, leaning forward earnestly. Charles Morrison's prison breaking wasn't just about freeing his family. It disrupted something larger. The network of bindings that connected all these places. Each site that falls makes the others more unstable. And you're telling me this because when they start failing, Marcus, they're going to fail catastrophically. And the people maintaining them won't know how to stop it. I pulled on my jeans and a sweatshirt. Show me. Jensen led me out to my car, somehow managing to sit in the passenger seat, despite being translucent. As I drove toward the shop, he continued explaining. What Mrs. Carver didn't tell you is that her grandfather wasn't just a businessman who happened to buy cursed land. He was recruited by other families dealing with similar supernatural prisons. They formed a network, sharing information, techniques, resources. A conspiracy of supernatural jailers. Exactly. And they've been preparing for the possibility of widespread containment failure for decades. We arrived at Thornfield Antiques to find Mrs. Carver's Buick already in the parking lot, along with 2 other cars I didn't recognize. Light spilled from the shop windows, and I could see figures moving inside. She knows we're coming, Jensen said, starting to fade. My time is almost up. Marcus, find the other places. Find them and help free the spirits trapped there before the network decides to implement their final solution. What final solution? But Jensen was gone, leaving only the faint scent of old books and coffee. I entered the shop through the front door, setting off the customer bell. Mrs. Carver called from the back office. We're in here, Marcus. The office had been rearranged to accommodate 6 people. Mrs. Carver sat behind her desk, looking older and more frail than I'd ever seen her. 3 other elderly individuals occupied chairs arranged in a semicircle. 2 women and a man, all dressed in expensive clothing that probably cost more than my car. The 6th person made my blood freeze. He stood in the corner, watching me with the same burning coal eyes I'd seen in Charles Morrison's spirit. But this man was alive, middle-aged, wearing a modern suit. The resemblance was unmistakable. Marcus, Mrs. Carver said carefully. Mrs. Jonathan Morrison. Charles's great-great-nephew. Jonathan Morrison stepped forward, extending a hand. I didn't take it. Mr. Hoffman, I want to thank you for freeing my ancestors. You've given me an opportunity I've been waiting for my entire life. Which is? One of the elderly women, a severe-looking matron with silver hair, spoke up. To complete Charles Morrison's work, of course. Your amateur liberation has destabilized our entire network. Containment failures are cascade occurring across the country. We're here to implement emergency protocols. Mrs. Carver avoided my eyes. Marcus, I should have told you about the Morrison family descendants, about the custodial network. But I hoped freeing Eleanor and the children would be enough. Enough for what? Jonathan Morrison pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it on Mrs. Carver's desk. Inside were architectural drawings, ritual diagrams, and what looked like corporate organizational charts. The network my ancestor established wasn't meant to imprison spirits forever, Mr. Hoffman. It was meant to study them, learn from them, and eventually replicate their state in living subjects. What you call a prison, we call a laboratory. The man sitting next to the silver-haired woman cleared his throat. Mr. Morrison's research was revolutionary. The ability to bind souls to objects, to create conscious spirits that could work indefinitely without the limitations of physical bodies. The applications are limitless. You're talking about enslaving human souls. We're talking about transcending human limitations, Jonathan corrected. Death, aging, the constraints of physical existence. Charles Morrison found a way to preserve consciousness indefinitely. We've spent 137 years perfecting his methods. Mrs. Carver spoke quietly. The network operates 6 primary sites, Marcus. Each one maintains dozens of bound spirits. When you freed the Morrison family, it created spiritual resonance that weakened all the other bindings. The silver-haired woman smiled coldly. We have perhaps 6 months before complete containment failure. Hundreds of spirits released simultaneously, many of them far more dangerous than Eleanor and her children. The chaos would be significant. So stop maintaining the bindings. Let them go free. Jonathan Morrison laughed. Mr. Hoffman, many of these spirits were bound because they were dangerous when alive. Mass murderers, cult leaders, individuals who practiced the darkest forms of occultism. Would you really unleash them on an unsuspecting world? I looked at Mrs. Carver. Is this true? She nodded reluctantly. Not all the spirits in the network are innocent victims, Marcus. Some were imprisoned for good reasons. Which is why we're implementing the completion protocol, the third elderly person said. He had a slight accent I couldn't place. Rather than allow uncontrolled releases, we'll activate the primary bindings at all sites simultaneously. Complete the transformation Charles Morrison began. What transformation? Jonathan Morrison's eyes gleamed. The conversion of human consciousness into controllable spiritual entities. Every living person within a mile radius of each facility will be pulled into the network. Their souls will be bound to the system, creating a permanent spiritual workforce under the control of the custodial families. I backed toward the door. You're insane. We're efficient, the silver-haired woman corrected. And we have Mrs. Carver's cooperation. Mrs. Carver looked up at me, tears in her eyes. Marcus, they're threatening to release the dangerous spirits first, to let them rampage through populated areas unless I help implement the protocol. What choice do I have? The choice to trust that there's another way. I thought about Jensen's visit, about his mention of other sites. How long do I have? The autumn equinox, Jonathan Morrison said. September 22nd. The alignment will be optimal for simultaneous binding activation. That gives us, he checked his watch, 4 months to prepare. And if I try to stop you? The silver-haired woman smiled again. Mr. Hoffman, you've already been exposed to significant spiritual energy. You've formed connections with the entities we study. Those connections work both ways. She gestured to Jonathan Morrison, who pulled out what looked like a small mirror from his pocket. In its surface, I saw my own reflection, but wrong, somehow. Older, paler, with eyes that held too much knowledge and pain. Your soul is already partially bound to our network, Jonathan explained. Not enough to control you yet, but enough to locate you anywhere on Earth. If you interfere with the protocol, we'll simply accelerate your personal binding process. Mrs. Carver, you can't seriously be considering this. She stood up slowly. Go home, Marcus. Pack what you need and leave town. Don't come back here. Don't try to contact me. Live whatever life you can for the next 4 months. And after September 22nd? After September 22nd, the question of life versus death will be academic for most of humanity. The man with the accent said pleasantly. I left the shop in a daze, my mind reeling. 4 months to stop a supernatural conspiracy that had spent over a century preparing. 4 months to save not just the spirits trapped in the network, but everyone who would be caught in their final transformation. As I drove home, I saw Jensen in my rearview mirror one more time. He was standing in the shop's parking lot, surrounded by other translucent figures, all the guards who had worked at Thornfield over the years. He pointed north toward Maine's border with New Hampshire. Then he pointed west toward Vermont, then south, the locations of the other facilities. I had my map. Now I just needed to figure out how to stop a supernatural conspiracy that had roots stretching back to the Victorian era. In 4 months on the autumn equinox, they'd activate the completion protocol. Unless I found the other imprisoned spirits first and convinced them to help free themselves. Paul Jensen had said it himself. Each site that falls makes the others more unstable. Time to start a chain reaction. I spent the next week preparing. If I was going to take on a supernatural conspiracy, I needed more than good intentions and a thermos of coffee. I photocopied every page of Charles Morrison's journal, researched the historical locations Jensen had pointed toward, and converted my life savings into cash. Credit cards could be traced. The first facility was easier to find than I'd expected. A little research into mysterious disappearances and haunted locations in New Hampshire led me to the Whitmore Inn in Portsmouth. Built in 1886 by shipping magnate Ezra Whitmore, the inn had a history of guests checking in and never checking out. Local legend spoke of a mysterious woman in white who wandered the halls, and staff members reported hearing children's laughter from rooms that had been empty for decades. What really caught my attention was a newspaper article from 1923. Whitmore Inn under investigation, following guest disappearances. The piece mentioned that Ezra Whitmore had been experimenting with spiritual communication devices before his death, and that several guests had reported feeling compelled to remain even after their planned departures. The inn was still operating, now run by Whitmore's great-granddaughter, Margaret Whitmore Chen. I checked in under a false name on a Tuesday afternoon. The building looked like every other historic New England inn. White clapboard siding, black shutters, widow's walk on the roof. The kind of place that charged extra for authentic colonial charm and had brochures about ghost tours. Margaret greeted me at the front desk. She was in her 60s, with the kind of warm smile that made you feel instantly welcome. Nothing about her suggested she was maintaining a supernatural prison. "Room 237, she said, handing me an old-fashioned brass key. "On the second floor. Lovely view of the harbor. Just so you know, we do ask guests to observe quiet hours between midnight and 6 a.m. Some of our long-term residents are sensitive to noise." That confirmed my suspicions. No inn refers to guests as long-term residents unless something unusual is keeping them there. My room was exactly what you'd expect. 4-poster bed, antique furniture, paintings of ships on the walls. I waited until midnight, then began exploring. The hallways were different at night, longer somehow, with more doors than I remembered seeing during the day. Soft voices drifted from behind several rooms, conversations in languages I couldn't identify. From room 204, I heard a woman humming what sounded like a sea chanty. In the lobby, I found what I was looking for. Hidden behind the front desk was a door marked "Private, Whitmore Family Only." It was locked, but I'd learned a few things about old buildings during my time fixing up my grandmother's house. The doorframe had enough give that a credit card and some patience could work wonders. The door opened onto a staircase leading down to the inn's basement. Unlike Thornfield's makeshift laboratory, this felt purpose-built. The walls were lined with ships' figureheads, dozens of carved women with flowing hair and outstretched hands. But these weren't decorative. Each figurehead had been altered, fitted with metal plates covered in symbols similar to what I'd seen in Charles Morrison's journal. At the center of the room stood a ship's wheel, mounted vertically like a steering mechanism, made of some dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As I approached, the wheel began to turn on its own, clicking like a clock mechanism. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around to find Margaret Whitmore Chen standing at the bottom of the stairs. She no longer looked welcoming. Her eyes held the same calculating coldness I'd seen in the custodial network members. "Neither should they," I said, pointing to the figureheads. "How many souls are bound to your family's collection?" 47, she answered without hesitation. "Passengers and crew members from ships that foundered off Portsmouth Harbor. My great-grandfather gave them a choice: bind their souls to the inn and serve the Whitmore family, or face whatever awaited them in the depths of the Atlantic. That's not a choice. That's coercion." Margaret moved to the ship's wheel, placing her hands on its spokes. "They've had comfortable accommodations for over a century, Mr. Hoffman. Yes, I know who you are. The network has been tracking you since you left Knowbrook." The figureheads began to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. I could see faces appearing in the carved wood, men and women trapped in expressions of eternal sorrow. Why maintain this? Why not let them go? Because their labor powers the inn's bindings. They clean the rooms, prepare the meals, welcome the guests. All the work of running a business, performed by souls who never tire, never age, never demand wages. And you think that's acceptable? Margaret's grip tightened on the wheel. "I think survival is acceptable. Do you know what happens to the custodial families if our sights fail? The bound spirits don't just blame their original captors. They blame anyone who maintained their prisons." I thought about Charles Morrison's journal, remembering the liberation protocols. It doesn't have to be this way. The spirits can free themselves if they work together. With the right knowledge, yes, but I'm not going to hand them the keys to their own cages. She began turning the wheel clockwise. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but the network gave me specific instructions about what to do if you found this place." The figurehead nearest to me suddenly turned its carved head toward me. Its wooden lips moved, speaking in a voice like wind through rigging. "Join us, Night Guardian. Your soul can anchor here, keep us stable, keep us together." More figureheads began speaking, their voices overlapping. "Stay with us. Don't leave us alone. One more soul won't hurt." I felt the same compulsion I'd experienced with the music box at Thornfield, an overwhelming urge to accept, to let go of the burden of choice. But I'd learned something about resisting supernatural influence. I pulled out Charles Morrison's journal and began reading the Liberation Protocol aloud, focusing on the sections about internal rebellion and coordinated resistance. Margaret tried to shout over me, but the figureheads glowing intensified. One of them, a woman with intricate braids carved into her wooden hair, spoke in a clearer voice. "Wait. Listen to him. He's telling us how to break free." "Sarah, no." Margaret twisted the wheel harder. "Return to dormancy." But Sarah's figurehead continued to glow. "Sisters, brothers, hear his words. We can choose our own freedom." The other figureheads began to pulse with light in unison. As I continued reading, their carved features became more animated, more human. The binding symbols on the metal plates started to crack and flake away. Margaret pulled a knife from somewhere in her coat and lunged toward me. I dodged, still reading from the journal. She grabbed for the book, but Sarah's figurehead spoke again. "The wheel, traveler. Turn it counterclockwise." I understood immediately. The ship's wheel was the control mechanism, like Charles Morrison's obsidian altar. I tackled Margaret, wrestling the wheel away from her grip and spinning it in the opposite direction. The basement filled with the sound of splintering wood. One by one, the figureheads began to crack and break apart. But instead of destruction, each fracture released a glowing human form, the actual spirits of the bound sailors and passengers. They looked nothing like the carved representations that had held them. These were real people, wearing clothes from various eras, their faces showing relief and amazement. "Free," Sarah whispered, now appearing as a middle-aged woman in 1890s dress. "We're actually free." Margaret sat on the basement floor, staring at the ruins of her great-grandfather's binding system. "The network will punish me for this failure." "Then come with us," I said. "Help us free the others." She shook her head. "You don't understand. The network doesn't just threaten punishment. They follow through. My cousin tried to leave in 1987. They bound his soul to a paperweight. He sits on Jonathan Morrison's desk, conscious but unable to move or speak." The freed spirits gathered around the destroyed ship's wheel. Some were already beginning to fade, moving on to whatever came after death. Others seemed to be waiting for something. "Go," Sarah told me. "We'll remain here long enough to protect Margaret from immediate retaliation. Some of us have unfinished business with the living members of the network." I left the inn as the sun was rising, driving south toward my next target. In the rearview mirror, I saw smoke rising from the building. Not fire, but the ethereal glow of departing spirits. 2 down, 4 to go. The next facility was in Salem, Massachusetts, the boarding house Jensen had mentioned. By the time I reached it, news of the Portsmouth incident had apparently spread through the network. The boarding house was surrounded by men in dark suits, and police had cordoned off the street. But as I drove past, I saw something that gave me hope. Standing on the boarding house's front porch, visible only to me, were the spirits I'd freed from the inn. Sarah waved and pointed toward the back of the building. They were already getting to work. I parked 3 blocks away and approached on foot. The police seemed focused on the front of the building, leaving the alley behind it unwatched. I climbed a fire escape to the 2nd floor and found an unlocked window. Inside, the building was chaos. Dark-suited men shouted orders while others frantically performed what looked like binding rituals in several rooms. But their efforts kept failing. Each time they'd start a chant or activate a piece of equipment, it would suddenly stop working. In one room, I saw why. A woman in Puritan dress stood behind one of the men, her transparent hands covering his eyes. Every time he tried to read from a binding grimoire, she'd move his head so he'd miss lines. The spirits from Portsmouth were already inside, working to disrupt the network's containment efforts. I found the boarding house's basement binding chamber, a circular room with 13 chairs arranged around a cast-iron cauldron. This facility held the souls of women executed during the Salem witch trials, supposedly bound to help the facility's owners continue the work of finding witches. The liberation took 20 minutes. The Salem spirits had been imprisoned longer than any others I'd encountered, and their anger was significant. When they broke free, several network operatives fled the building screaming about women with burning eyes and voices like grinding millstones. 3 facilities liberated. 3 more to go before the autumn equinox. But I was no longer working alone. Each group of freed spirits joined the growing supernatural army, moving from site to site. By the time I reached the plantation mansion in Savannah, we had over 100 spirits working to collapse the network's bindings. The network seemed to realize they were losing control. Instead of trying to stop us, they accelerated their timeline. On September 15th, 1 week before the planned date, they began the completion protocol anyway, starting with Thornfield Antiques. The phone rang at exactly 3:33 a.m. I'd been expecting it. Not the time. That was probably Eleanor's sense of humor. But the call itself. After destroying 5 of the 6 network facilities, we knew they'd make their final stand at Thornfield. Marcus. Mrs. Carver's voice was strained, exhausted. They're here. All of them. Jonathan Morrison brought equipment from the other sites, something called a soul anchor cascade. They're going to bind every spirit in a 50-mile radius to the shop. I was already putting on my shoes. How long do I have? They started the ritual 20 minutes ago. It takes an hour to reach full resonance. Through my phone, I heard chanting in the background, voices speaking in the same fevered tones Charles Morrison had used during his original experiments. The Custodio network was attempting to create exactly what he'd envisioned, a massive collection of enslaved souls under the control of the living. Mrs. Carver, you need to get out of there. I can't. They've bound me to the ritual circle as the anchor point. If I die, the binding transfers to whoever's nearest. They've surrounded the building with innocent people, Marcus. Customers who came in today and couldn't leave. Neighbors who wandered too close. If this goes wrong... The line went dead. I drove toward Thornfield with my entire supernatural army. Sarah from the Portsmouth Inn sat in my passenger seat, her spectral form flickering but solid. In the back seat, 3 women from Salem whispered strategies in languages that predated English. Through my rearview mirror, I could see the procession following me. Dozens of freed spirits moving through the night like a luminous parade. The shop was surrounded by dark SUVs and men in suits. But something was wrong with the picture. The men stood perfectly still, their eyes vacant, staring at the building. As we got closer, I realized the truth. The network had started binding people before we arrived. The operatives outside weren't guards anymore. They were the first victims of their own ritual. We entered through the basement, where Charles Morrison's obsidian altar still sat, cracked and dark. Sarah led the charge up the stairs while I followed with Morrison's journal. The shop had been transformed into a massive binding circle, with antiques arranged in precise patterns around the main floor. Mrs. Carver sat in the center, her hands bound to a chair that thrummed with supernatural energy. Jonathan Morrison and the 3 other network leaders stood at cardinal points around her, chanting from a book that looked suspiciously like a more complete version of the Morrison Journal. The air itself felt thick, charged with spiritual energy being forcibly collected and redirected. I could see wisps of light being drawn from everything in the building, and from outside, where people wandered in dazed circles, their life force slowly being siphoned away. "You're too late," Jonathan called out, not stopping his chant. "The cascade is at 90%. In 5 minutes, every soul within 50 miles becomes part of our collection." That's when Sarah and the others acted. Instead of attacking the network leaders directly, they did something unexpected. Each spirit grabbed onto one of the binding lines, the streams of stolen soul energy flowing toward the ritual circle, and pushed their own power in the opposite direction. The binding lines began to glow brighter, then shake, then snap like overstretched cables. The carefully arranged antiques exploded outward as the accumulated energy backfired into the network's own equipment. I opened Morrison's journal and began reading the liberation protocol, but louder, with the confidence of someone who'd done this 5 times before. The freed spirits added their voices to mine, creating a chorus that shook the building's foundation. The soul anchor cascade collapsed in a shower of sparks and spiritual energy. Jonathan Morrison's scream was cut short as the backlash hit him, his own soul torn from his body and scattered like smoke. Mrs. Carver slumped forward, freed from the chair but unconscious. The other network leaders lay still, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Outside, I could hear people calling to each other, their voices confused but alive. The binding had been broken before it could fully take hold. I found Mrs. Carver's pulse, weak but steady. Sarah knelt beside me, already beginning to fade now that her mission was complete. "It's finished," she said. "All of us can rest now." As the sun rose over Millbrook, the last of the freed spirits departed. Mrs. Carver woke up in the hospital 3 days later with no memory of the final ritual. The official story blamed the gas leak for the confusion and the network leaders' deaths. I stayed in Millbrook. Someone had to keep an eye on that basement, and Mrs. Carver needed time to adjust to running the normal antique shop. The irony isn't lost on me. I went from night security guard to day manager, watching over a store full of harmless old things. No rules to follow except the usual ones about customer service and closing times. Sometimes, late at night when I'm doing inventory, I hear echoes. Not ghosts. The Morrisons and everyone else moved on completely. Just echoes of voices, laughter, the sound of children playing. Reminders of lives that were, briefly, imprisoned, but ultimately found freedom. Mrs. Carver asked me once if I missed the excitement, the supernatural threats, the mysterious rules, the constant danger. I told her the truth. I sleep better now knowing that the people who died here can finally rest. But I also told her the other truth. I keep Morrison's journal locked in the desk drawer, just in case someone else gets ideas about binding souls to antiques. Some knowledge is too dangerous to lose, but too important to forget. The basement door stays locked, not because something terrible lurks below, but because some prisons should remain empty as warnings. And every morning at 6 a.m., when I unlock the front door for another day of normal business, I remember that sometimes the best rules are the ones we choose to follow freely, the ones that keep us human.